Hello, everybody. Good evening. My name is Leanne, and I'm the Education Coordinator here at the People's Forum. We are so excited that you're all here. This is an extremely important event, and we're very grateful that you took time out of your Monday evening to join us. The People's Forum is a movement incubator for working class and marginalized communities. Our aim is to provide cultural and educational programming that builds unity across lines of division. So this is extremely important to our mission. Kashmir is the most militarized zone in the world, but oftentimes one of the least discussed, and there's not very much awareness about it, especially here. So for those of us that are concerned with militarization, colonialism, occupation, and all of these issues, this is really essential for us to learn more about and to build a consciousness about. So hopefully this is not the last time we have an event like this, and I'm very honored and very humbled to introduce our two speakers today. Hafsa Kanjwal is an assistant professor of South Asian history at Lafayette College. She completed her PhD in history and women's studies at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Her research focuses on post-partition state formation in Indian occupied Kashmir, and she has written on Kashmir for a variety of news outlets, including the Washington Post, Al Jazeera English, Kindle Magazine, Foreign Policy Magazine, Kashmir Life, Kashmir Inc., and the Al Jazeera Center for Study. She has also spoken on Kashmir for Al Jazeera English's The Stream and Inside Story news programs. Junaid teaches cultural anthropology at the Massachusetts College of Liberal Arts. He has a PhD in anthropology from the Graduate Center at CUNY, and his research interests include formation of political subjectivity, military occupations, space and place, violence and precarity, visual politics, memory, and cultural production. He has written on Kashmir in both scholarly and news publications, and you can find a list of those on our website under his biography. And his essays have also appeared in Economic and Political Weekly, Greater Kashmir, Tanqid, Al Jazeera, Turkish radio and television, Tehelka, and Guernica. He grew up in Kashmir. So without further ado, I'll pass it on to our speakers, and I hope you enjoy.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Everyone can hear me? Okay. Thank you so much for coming today to join us in a really important conversation on Kashmir. And I wanted to thank Layan and the People's Forum for hosting us here. So when we arranged and scheduled this teach-in, it was actually before the Pulwama attacks and the escalation and de-escalation of war between India and Pakistan. And given that that has happened in the past month, it's even more important that we have this conversation here today. And for us as Kashmiris living outside of Kashmir, observing how the news about Kashmir gets reported, I think what was really tangible was how Kashmiri voices were erased in that entire time. So even though Kashmir is the root cause of the dispute between India and Pakistan, after the attacks happened and after both countries were going to war, the actual experiences, lives, and suffering of Kashmiris living under an occupation currently was completely erased. And that's really how the story of Kashmir has been told in so many ways, that it's a territorial dispute, it's a conflict between India and Pakistan, in other circles that it's an extremist sort of jihadi secessionist movement. And I hope being here today you can get a sense of how those narratives don't really work. And when you actually foreground Kashmiri voices, aspirations, histories, that it is really a struggle, a prolonged struggle for the right to self-determination and an end to occupation. So today we will be talking a bit about the history. I'll go a bit more into the history of Kashmir. Junaid will talk about what happened in the late 1980s and 1990s with the armed rebellion against Indian rule, as well as the militarization of everyday society, and what constitutes militarization and occupation in the context of Kashmir. Then I will speak a bit about how we can link Kashmir to other struggles for global solidarity and global justice. And Junaid will talk about how regional political dynamics between India, Pakistan, and China and changing developments impact the issue. And we'll end with sort of talking about what we think is important when it comes to understanding a solution or what needs to happen for Kashmir and what everyone here can do in terms of solidarity. And hopefully we should have enough time for Q&A after all of that.
Okay, thank you so much, Hafsa, and thank you, Layan, and People's Forum for having us here. I haven't done one thing before. We talk about Kashmir a lot, but I've often realized that in America, when you're talking about a place like Kashmir, people might think it's a sweater or something, or a Led Zeppelin, album. So I'm gonna do basic Kashmir 101 at the beginning, 5 minutes. I wanna locate where Kashmir is. What is it that we're talking about in terms of map and population and things like that? Just to give you a fair context of the history that Hafsa will later on delve into. So behind me, you can see this map. It's not always to scale, but this is the 1947 Kashmir, which is at the root of political contestation, both within Kashmir as well as in the region. This was the Kashmir that had existed from 1846 to 1947 in a variety of formations. And if you go in deeper into history, there is a continuity of Kashmir being a region. Kashmir having independent governments, independent monarchies, and Kashmiris saw Kashmir as home, as a political space, as a space where they interacted with each other, traded with each other. Kashmir existed as an entity in their minds. That's what I'm trying to say. If you look at the distribution of population in Kashmir, you can see a majority of the population is concentrated on the western side, this region. The eastern part is mostly high mountains, high deserts, it's extension of the Tibetan plateau, and it's called Ladakh. It's very sparsely populated, distant villages. It currently has a population close to 200,000. Compared to the overall population of the state, which is around 15 million people, excluding the diaspora. So we're talking about a large group of people, a huge population. Most of these people, most of the people of Kashmir, and when I say Kashmiris, I mean the residents of the historic Kashmir who were the subjects of the 1947 state. And I don't mean necessarily simply Kashmiri-speaking people or Muslims, okay? But Kashmir is also, it's not divided, but it had a majority of Muslim population. If you look at the areas that are green, it's primarily Muslim. And you look at the purple, that's primarily Hindu. And then in the east, as I said, the sparsely populated area, it's a mix of Buddhist and Muslims. Kashmir is the historic home of a variety of linguistic groups. The majority of people speak Kashmiri language, and there are other minor variations of Kashmiri that people speak. In the south and west, a lot of people speak Punjabi. Gojri is another language that people speak towards the west. In the further north, in all the pink and the blues, there are ancient languages that are spoken. There's sparsely populated areas, but very ancient languages. So it's a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, pluralistic space that we are talking about. And this was the space, and Hafsa will bring us up to date on the history of what happened in 1947. In 1947, all of this space was divided in wars of conquest between India and Pakistan into two large chunks. Majority of that area is now under the Indian control, which is the area in saffron, and then the areas which are in green are under Pakistani control. Then in the 1962 war between India and China, part of Ladakh up in the north east was taken over by China. That's how China got involved in the whole dispute, because China claimed that area is called Aksai Chin. It's barely anyone lives there, but it is under Chinese control right now. And I'll leave you with this image. This is the image of the line of control as it exists now between India and Pakistan. It's the most militarized region in the world. I mean, more than the DMZ, the line between the Koreas, and it's all mined. Like you can't, even the cattle can't cross. I mean, the image that comes to my mind is that in India recently, the cow has become a symbol of like sacred nationalism and stuff. But if you actually go close to this region, you can see carcasses of hundreds of cows who are dead because of all of this, walls and the land mining of that region. I'll just leave it to Hafsana to bring us.
Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, the history of Kashmir is obviously very contested. Mostly you get perspectives from Indian nationalist historians or Pakistani nationalist historians, and again, the experiences of Kashmiris are not involved in that. So what I want to do is really tell the history of Kashmir as a struggle of the Kashmiri people to fight for their right to self-determination that actually goes beyond the 1947 temporal sort of boundary. So everyone understands that the conflict, or explains that the conflict happened at 1947 and that this land somehow became divided, but Kashmiri historians, or those who are paying attention to actual Kashmiri histories, go farther back into time, into 1931. And as Junaid mentioned, Kashmir was identified as a political and social space and cultural space that had its own identity. And in the medieval and ancient times, there were different independent kingdoms with ties to Central Asia. So because of 1947, Kashmir gets pushed into the South Asia rubric, but Kashmir actually had significant ties to Central Asia through the Silk Route. And those ties were completely destroyed as a result of the past 70 or so years. And we usually begin our history of Kashmir by talking about the late colonial period, so the 30s, or modern Kashmir, the 30s and the 40s, when Kashmir was ruled by a family, a Hindu family in the region of Jammu called the Dogras. And the British basically gave the Dogras this land. They sold essentially the land, its peoples, its rivers, its resources to this family because they helped them in earlier wars. And as a result, vast majority of Kashmiris, most of whom were peasants, were subjugated under these rulers, mostly Muslim peasants. And even up until 1941, only less than 2% of Kashmiri Muslims in particular were literate. So this was a population that was heavily subjugated. Many had to do forced labor. They weren't able to take part in the state bureaucracy. And the Dogras, in many ways, effectively ran a Hindu state, a state that protected was sort of defined in very Hindu terms. So in 1931, you had a mobilization that begins of Kashmiri Muslims in particular who are going outside of the state, studying in other places outside of Kashmir, in Aligarh, in Lahore. This is all before partition. And they are becoming mobilized about their rights, and they're trying to understand democracy and realizing what's happening in Kashmir. So this is where the mobilization actually begins, is to fight for more self-determination, better educational and economic rights before partition itself. Now, what happens in 1947 is that this movement essentially gets derailed and pushed into the logic of partition, which basically stated that Muslim majority states should go to Pakistan and Hindu majority states should go with India. And because Kashmir was a princely state, it was ran by a Dogra and a Hindu ruler, but most of the population was majority. This is where sort of the confusion and the tension lies. And it's known that the Dogra ruler himself would have preferred independence, but what ends up happening, and this is actually critical to the story, because when you talk about 1947, the narrative that's usually stated is that there was a tribal raid coming from the land that became Pakistan that was going to take over Kashmir for Pakistan. And in return, the Dogra ruler asked the Indian government for help against this raid. And that's where he signed a treaty of accession and gave this entire territory to India, and that's why Kashmir is an integral part of India. But when you contest some of those and you look into some of those narratives, there's a lot of false equivalents made in this narrative. So the first important thing to realize is that the movement was actually an indigenous movement that was in the region of Jammu by Kashmiri Muslims who were living in Jammu, and they did not want to be a part of the Dogra state. They rebelled against the Dogra Maharaja, and he quashed that movement quite heavily. So historians say that up to 200,000 Muslims in Jammu were massacred in that time. And this massacre has been completely erased in the story of partition. We know, of course, about what happens in Punjab. We know about killings and refugees and migrations, but what happened in Kashmir was completely erased. So 200,000 Muslims killed, 250,000 were forced to migrate to the other side of the border, to Pakistan, and that completely changed the demographics of Jammu. And because of this massacre, Muslims from northwest Pakistan, what's known as the tribals, came to try to liberate, in their understandings, Kashmiri Muslims from the Indian state and from the Dogras. So that is where that angle comes in. And this is where the Maharaja gets scared. He's afraid that he's going to lose his power, so he asks the government of India for military assistance. The government of India says that they won't give him any assistance unless he signs a treaty of accession, and he does so. And basically the terms of the treaty are that India has control over the foreign affairs, the communications, and the defense of Kashmir, and the future of the state would be determined by reference to the people. So in the Treaty of Accession itself is this recognition that this is a temporary state and that the future of the region would be determined by the people. So India comes in and helps assist in this fight against the tribals. So just to go back to the pictures, these are images of Kashmiris living under Dogra rule in the late colonial period. And this is an image from an actual an incident that sort of sparked the 1931 movement when Kashmiri Muslims were killed by the Dogra army. And this is a newspaper article from the time of the accession. So you can see on the actual title, it says, Kashmir accedes to India, plebiscite soon on ruler's decision. So this was what the discourse was in 1947. So this is an image of the Indian army coming into Kashmir in 1947, and this is where many Kashmiris believe that their occupation actually began, is in 1947 itself, and not later on in the time period that Junaid will be talking about. So they really situate this military occupation as starting in 1947. Okay, so India and Pakistan basically go to war. India then takes the issue to the United Nations, and the United Nations declares that there should be a cessation of hostilities and a plebiscite that would be held in the region. And at that time, the only two options for the plebiscite are India and Pakistan. And within Kashmir, after 1947, India basically sets up a series of client regimes that only answer to India, essentially. So this part between 1947 and the late 1980s, India is not directly managing Kashmir's affairs. They're doing it through these client governments of Kashmiri rulers themselves, who have to be pro-accession. So India basically says that, well, after 47, we let Kashmiris have elections, so of course that those elections mean that they accepted Indian rule. But only pro-Indian parties were allowed to participate in those elections, and the opposition wasn't allowed to. So over time, India also erodes the state's autonomy. So again, as I referenced, India was only supposed to take control of the state's the foreign affairs, defense, and communications, but then it starts getting involved into other domestic affairs. And that is what really upsets a lot of Kashmiri leaders who even initially had been okay with the accession, given that there was this autonomous status that was to be given to Kashmir. So one of those leaders, Sheikh Abdullah, who initially was with the accession, then went against it, was arrested in 1953, and another ruler was put into power. And basically, the next subsequent decades within Kashmiri history is this history of a ruler being put into place. He comes too far, Delhi's not happy with what he's doing, he's taken out of power, another more amenable ruler is put into power. But what's also important to know is that there was a lot of movements against what was happening in Kashmir in this time. So there's a pro-plebiscite, popular movements, pro-plebiscite, pro-self-determination movements that are heavily quashed by the Indian government and by the state government. So this is just an image from, and you can when you see some of these later pictures of the post-90s period, it's these same images where Kashmiris are taking to the streets and demanding that the plebiscite be held. And this picture is from the 1950s. So it's not that just after the 1980s where Kashmiris started rebelling, but even in this period after partition, there was no finality of India's rule in Kashmir. And when you actually uncover some of those stories and the stories of those movements, which have been erased in many ways from the archive, then you can really get a sense of that. So in the late 70s, there's also a more pro-independence consciousness that begins to emerge, especially by Kashmiris that are in the diaspora in the UK, who are both sick of Indian and Pakistani treatment of their issue. And that became increasingly strong in the period that Junaid will be talking about. But what ends up happening is that in the 1975, there's an agreement signed between the Kashmiri leadership at the time and the Indian government to declare that the accession is final. And this is where people start to get really disillusioned with their peaceful and constitutional means of trying to have their rights be met. And there's also geopolitics, changing geopolitics that are happening in the region with the Iranian Revolution, the Afghan struggle against the Soviets, as well as other armed struggles like the Intifada. And Kashmiris basically feel that all the peaceful means that they've used to demand that this plebiscite be held are being completely ignored by the international community. So that then brings us to the second stage of this history, which is the stage of militarization and an armed insurrection against Indian rule.
Thank you. Okay, so in 1980s, many of these repressed Kashmiri formations who had been asking for plebiscite, who had been asking for independence or resolution of the Kashmir issue, finally gathered together and decided to form an organization called Muslim United Front. Muslim United Front chose to contest elections. They claimed that they wanted to show to the Indian government and the international community that they were the actual representatives of the Kashmiri people. In 1987, the largest turnout took place in Kashmir. The largest number of people came out to vote, and from anecdotal evidence, we don't know the actual final results, what happened. From anecdotal evidence, they would have won a landslide victory. But as many Indian analysts themselves and historians agree that this was the most rigged elections in the Kashmir's post-1947 era. This was followed when the elections were rigged. Many of these groups protested. People were out on the streets, and they were demanding resolution. You remember also that late 1980s was also a moment of catharsis world over. The wall in Germany had just fallen. The Soviets were withdrawing from Afghanistan. New states were emerging all over the place. So Kashmiris, this protest was large, part of the larger assemblage of protests that were taking place globally. But Indian government, which already had close to 300,000 soldiers in the region, not including the special forces, special police forces, and the surveillance state forces that existed, they sent in more troops, which led to confrontations on the streets. This is a picture from the 90s. A massacre, several series of massacres took place in in Srinagar, in Kupwara, Handwara, all of these places in Kashmir. And by February of 1990, close to 400 people had been shot dead in these protests. And this led to an emergence of, there were already some armed activists in Kashmir, people who believed that armed revolution is going to resolve Kashmir, but they hadn't caught on the popular imagination so much. Kashmiris, for a very long time, were a very peaceful, place. They hadn't picked up arms against their rulers. They had protested, they had died in protest, but they hadn't picked up weapons. But seeing these massacres, hundreds upon hundreds of Kashmiri youth crossed over to the Pakistani-controlled side of Kashmir, which is also called Azad Kashmir, and used it as a base to start a rebellion against India. They returned to Kashmir, it suddenly this armed movement became a very popular movement. It gathered a storm. An entire Kashmiri nation was behind these people. India sent in 300,000 more soldiers into the region, both specially trained people who were going to fight the insurgency, but also regular territorial army, as well as paramilitary forces. They also gave them laws of imperious laws like Armed Force Special Powers Act, where the military could act with a free hand to suppress both the rebellion and control the population. And so I grew up there in the 90s, and seeing soldiers out on the streets trying to scare people was very common. Like psychological warfare, crackdowns, like asking people to sit down for hours on end like this, and pushing them in front of informers, terrorizing the population became a normal thing in the everyday life of Kashmiris. So you can see this is a typical scene from the early 90s of parents with their children being paraded in front of what were called cats. Cats were like informants who would, if they pointed at you, that would be the end of you. Like you would be disappeared, you would never be heard of again. So it was I have myself been through these exercises many times, and it would be the scariest experience ever to go through, be in that line and have like a person who may have been your neighbor, behind a headscarf or something, pointing at you or not pointing at you. The fact of militarization, everyday militarization of Kashmir, why I think that even though, as Hafsa said, that occupation began in 1947, but 1990 was a critical period in this intensification of occupation. Until like 1989, the Indian army was mostly concentrated on the border, as well as they were in big camps in civilian regions, but they hadn't so much fanned out into the civilian areas. In 1990, the army occupied school buildings, they occupied hospitals, they occupied government buildings. The public space was entirely militarized. You couldn't walk outside of your home and not see a soldier. And it led to enormous and different forms of violence. And one typical form of violence was like rape. In situations like this, independent sources in Kashmir, human rights activists say that close to 8,000 women were raped in the 1990s. And the most infamous of them was the Kunan Poshpora case in North Kashmir, where dozens of Kashmiri women were raped by Indian soldiers during the process of one night. And after that, even though there was some localized public outcry, and the Indian media sent a delegation to verify what had happened, but the delegation didn't even reach the village, and they gave a clean chit to the army. So this was complicity of the Indian institutions at a different level as well. It was not simply the government acting as scaffolding for the actions of the military, but also the civil society. Unfortunately, many of the people in the press at that time were people from the left. You wouldn't expect them to give a clean chit to the soldiers, but they did. Essentially, what it meant was they left no space for Kashmiris to imagine that justice was possible within the ambit of the Indian Constitution or Indian institutions. In mid-90s, by mid-90s, the armed rebellion was not under control. India controlled the public space, but the guerrilla warfare continued during this time. So they raised localized, what they call, this is their Indian term, renegades, which were local Kashmiris who were armed and surrendered militants who were brainwashed in the prisons and then unleashed upon the population. These were, this also happened in the face of rising international criticism at that time. Strangely, United States government was kind of closely involved in asking questions of Indian government. They were asking about human rights and stuff. So India chose to raise a local army of collaborators who would give India a plausible deniability, that we didn't do it. They are typically a classic case of unleashing the native on the native. From the Algerian situation, and India has not done it only in Kashmir. They did it in Punjab as well in the 80s. They did it in Chhattisgarh as well against the Maoists. And with the rise of these, renegades, locally called Ikhwanis as well, human rights abuses basically expanded and shot through the roof. So in the decade of 1990s, the lower estimates, the most conservative estimates, are that close to 70,000 people died during that time. Thousands of people spent time in prisons. They were circulated through the prison system. People like Shabir Shah, for instance, spent 27 years, almost the same time as Nelson Mandela, in the prison. There are still prisoners, Kashmiri prisoners, who have been there for 27 years. And they are invisibilized, of course, none as popular as Mandela. Thousands were forcibly disappeared, mostly sons, fathers, brothers, who would be picked in the dead of the night and never return, to their homes. There are thousands of unmarked mass graves across the border. People believe these wouldn't have been uncovered, but in 2005 there's a massive earthquake that took place, which suddenly shattered the militarized space on the border, and international organizations arrived both on the Pakistani controlled side and the Indian occupied side, and they were horrified to see thousands of mass graves there. And Indian government initially allowed the State Human Rights Commission to check what is going on, but that chapter, as the State Human Rights Commission found thousands upon thousands of graves, that not only was the investigation closed down, the State Human Rights Commission itself was closed down. So people believe that these thousands of people who had forcibly been disappeared may have ended up in these mass graves. By early 2000s, the armed militancy kind of tapered off, and the number of militants came down to low hundreds, maybe around 200 or so, according to the government's own figures. But the number of military personnel in Kashmir never came down. At the height, and this is still the case, close to 750,000 Indian soldiers remain. And these are regular troops that remain in Kashmir, and this is not counting close to 200,000 CRPF, which is the paramilitary force, and 100,000 Indian Kashmiri police, which is also highly militarized, that remain in the region. Just for the comparison's sake, at the height of occupation in Iraq, US had 170,000 soldiers. Yes, 170,000 soldiers. And Iraq at that time had a population of 24 million. Kashmir, the valley, which is mostly the highest populated region, has close to 7 million people, and it had 750,000 soldiers. So You can imagine for every Kashmiri, 10 Kashmiris, there was an Indian soldier watching over them, controlling minutely their everyday movement. So the rise of human rights gave, the civil society emerged during this time from the shadow of this war, this colonial war. And people came out on the streets in 2008, tired of being under the jackboot. Thousands upon thousands. In 2008, in Srinagar, there was one protest which had close to 500,000 people, participating in it. Srinagar has a population of 1.2 million people, which means that half of the city was out on the streets. Again, repression followed, massacres took place, pro-independence leaders like Sheikh Abdul Aziz were shot dead, on the roads, and Kashmiri youth came out on the streets, started pelting stones at Indian soldiers. The young people started dying in large numbers. Women, men, all came out on the streets. A picture like this was a typical fair on a Srinagar or in the countryside as well. Soldiers pointing guns at school children. Then in 2010, we had this huge protest emerge again. Close to 200 people during that time were shot to death, and thousands upon thousands, like close to 15,000 people were injured. Again, brutally repressed until 2016, when a young Kashmiri militant, this period between 2010 and 2016 was a critical time as well, because many young people who found no other way of expressing themselves chose to pick up weapons one more time. Some people have called it new militancy. These were mostly young, educated men, in some cases women too, who started an indigenous rebellion one more time. Most of the time they would snatch weapons from soldiers and play cat and mouse games. Typically, it would end in their death in like a matter of a few months. They had enormous popular appeal, but of course they couldn't take on a conventional army like India. So this is the image of Burhan Wani, whose death in 2016 provoked this ongoing rebellion that's going on right now for the last 3 years. Hundreds of thousands came to his funeral protest. This is one of the images of one of the funerals of Burhan Wani. He became the symbol of like this current phase of rebellion in Kashmir. Indian government not only used brutal tactics, killing people, arresting them, but also used inhuman technologies and weapons like pellet guns to maul, injure, and permanently destroy Kashmiri bodies. This is a headline from New York Times. Like the one time New York Times did a credible story on Kashmir, but actually called it the right name. There was an epidemic of massive blinding of Kashmiris. The most recent victim of this blinding was Hiba, a 4-year-old child in Kashmir who was shot by an Indian soldier from point blank range. And just the last point before we move on. Since 2016, close to like half of the time, Indian government imposes curfews across Kashmir, forcing people to stay inside, forcing them to not conduct their everyday business, keeping children out of schools. So everyday life in Kashmir right now is like living in an open-air prison. It's extremely claustrophobic. Whenever I go and see my family there, you can hear from their anguished narratives that this is not human. This is an expression of inhumanity and nothing more. of course, India shuts down all communications with outside. The recent event that Hafsa began with, the Palama Incident, where a young Kashmiri militant blew himself up and killed dozens of Indian soldiers. Immediately, India imposed an information blockade, shutting down the internet, and the Indian media jumped on this incident and literally proclaimed a war on Kashmiris, not only within Kashmir, but also outside of Kashmir. Dozens of Kashmiri students in India were beaten up ruthlessly by Hindu right-wing gangs. So I'll leave you at that, and I'll bring Hafsa to talk about international connections.
Okay, so as you can kind of tell from this narrative of occupation, militarization, it seems that Kashmir would raise interest in the international community, and that there would be some kind of solidarity movement for Kashmir as there are with other issues. But unfortunately, that's not the case. There's many reasons for this. One, I think primarily is that India continues to enjoy significant soft power in the world. And still, despite the fact that Hindu nationalism, which Junaid will go into later, has become rampant, and despite the killings against minorities and other issues that exist in the country, it's still seen as this land of yoga and peace-loving people and Gandhi, when it's very clearly not from the perspective of Kashmir and other regions in India. And not just that sort of cultural import, and again, Bollywood plays a big role in this as well, but also economically, most countries don't want to touch the Kashmir issue because for them, India is a huge market. And this includes a lot of Muslim majority countries as well, who might speak up or show some level of sympathies when things get really heightened in Kashmir, but otherwise continue to have significant ties with India. So for us, I mean, for people who are interested in issues of global justice and solidarity, I think it's important to see the ways in which Kashmir is linked to a lot of transnational issues. For people who are anti-war and anti-militarism and against nuclear proliferation, again, of course, with what happened in Pulwama, and the threat of nuclear war is a really real thing in Kashmir and in the region. But again, I think what's important to note there is, you know, with the level of solidarity or with the level of protests that happened after tensions with India and Pakistan escalated because of this threat of nuclear war, that's really the only time that Kashmir gets talked about. So when all of these massacres happen, when there's things that are happening against the people, you might just get a few lines in Al Jazeera or somewhere else. But only when the issue becomes between India and Pakistan does every single newspaper cover Kashmir or address the issue or, you know, have insight. And that's what's really frustrating for many of us who actually see that everyday life in Kashmir is actually war. And it's not just when the two countries go at it. So when it was interesting to see a lot of South Asians, at least in the diaspora, hold rallies and peace visuals saying no to war, where Kashmiri voices were never represented and there was really no talk of the fact that there is an occupation. So these kinds of narratives, again, get erased in the diaspora as well. So with this anti-war movement, anti-occupation and decolonizing struggles for self-determination, I mean, there's a lot of linkages with other struggles around the world, including Palestine. And for many Kashmiris, Palestine becomes sort of emblematic of what is happening to them is also happening to us. So there's a lot of solidarity for Palestine in Kashmir. Not this picture. So this is just graffiti from Srinagar, where you can see Free Gaza and We Want Free Kashmir. So whenever things are happening in Gaza or in Palestine, you'll always see graffiti that the Indian state actually just keeps. If there's ever things that say Free Kashmir or Azadi, which means freedom, they'll kind of write over it, but they somehow let the Free Gaza go. So that to them is not seen as threatening, but it's a way for Kashmiris to express their own sentiments about what's happening. So the earlier picture here is important because in recent years there have been increasing ties between India and Israel. And with Modi's government and with Netanyahu's government, these ties have only gotten stronger. So there's arms sales. India is the largest importer of Israeli arms. And in general, India is the second largest importer of arms in general in the world, most of them being used in Kashmir. There's military trainings that happen between the two countries, and just general ways and mechanisms of figuring out how to control and manage a population, and especially a Muslim population. So the war on terror and Islamophobia really plays a significant role here as well, where you have both countries using the discourse of the war on terror and these militant jihadist Muslims to justify their actions and their very brutal actions on these populations. And within India, Islamophobia, of course, exists within its own, with Indian minorities, Indian Muslim minorities, but is really, really heightened when it comes to Kashmiris. So anything that Kashmiris do becomes immediately, even people who are peacefully protesting get labeled as terrorists. And this isn't just the right-wing Hindutva nationalists, this also exists within the broader left and liberal class in India. And that is really where it's ironic to see that so many leftist Indians will support Palestine and will get involved in Palestine solidarity activism, but they never show up when it comes to Kashmir, and they completely are in some kind of weird nationalistic denial over what Indian actions in the region have been. At some points, you will get people who talk about human rights and how there shouldn't be a significant militarization of the region or that there shouldn't be human rights violations. That is the extent that most people will go to. But there are very few voices that are actually willing to talk about the actual occupation and the fact that this is an international dispute. But again, with the Palestine-Kashmir connection, there is, of course, affective solidarities that exist. There are some differences as well. So for most Palestinians, a one-state solution with equal rights and an end to apartheid is really important, but what Kashmiris are seeking is actually very different, is an ending of Indian rule, right? So it's not trying to join India or get better rights within India, as some of the other struggles that exist in India, that's what their aim is. It is to actually remove or be away from India. And one of the ways that it's interesting to see of how occupation manifests itself, for Palestinians, it's manifested itself in a politics of exclusion with the Nakba and the continuous ethnic cleansing that has happened. But during sort of the pre-Hindutva period in Kashmir, it really was this forced politics of inclusion, that you must join us. You know, there's this need to see the fact that Kashmir is a Muslim majority state with the kinds of anxieties around partition that exist in India, that we need to hold on to Kashmir to show that, yes, Muslims can survive in India and that it is a secular space. So there's just a lot of space for global solidarity, and I think these conversations need to be happening increasingly, and to connect Kashmir, I mean, just to think about things like tear gas. The tear gas that's used in Kashmir is also used in places like Ferguson and Palestine. So these very material, real things that exist to suppress people who are just demanding their rights.
Okay, so before we open up for questions, I just want to say a few things about, what is the source of all of this? Like the question that I ask myself, I spent a bunch of time in Delhi interacting with activists there and talking with people from what is called the northeast of India, the Nagaland, Manipur, the poor people from Chhattisgarh who are struggling for rights to the forest, leftist activists as well who want freedom of expression, or Dalit activists who are fighting for dignified citizenship. At the root of all of this, I believe, is a specific vision of India, and Indian nationalism, which is imperialistic in nature. India emerged, in its own telling, in secular telling, as out of an anti-colonial struggle. But then, why did it become a colonizer state itself? right? India, in my view, inherited an empire. When the British left, they left a huge vacuum there. They handed over power to the Indian nationalist elite, who had a specific vision of this region. They didn't want to consult with different nations, different nationalities, different communities, and ask for their opinion about whether we should form a union or not. You know, Kashmiris, of course, got trounced during this time. Their voices were not even, they were completely negated. Hafsa rightly mentioned that this is not simply right-wing. This is also the liberal vision of India, which is undergirded by an imperialist understanding. Because the map of India itself comes from Hindutva. This is not Hindu. Okay, this is Hindutva. It's a politicized form of Hinduism, which assumes this image of India as an Akhand Bharat, or united India, unbroken India, which includes, of course, parts of Afghanistan as well. And they see, for instance, 1947 as like vivisection of the organic body of India. In that vivisection, the narrative is that the Muslim of the subcontinent is the fifth column. He's the anti-national. He's the betrayer of the Mother India. This narrative has continued. Even now, if you look at the vision of the RSS is the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, which is the motherlode of all bad ideas, actually. It's the mothership of all the Hindu nationalist formations. Started in 1925, a unique organization, although, I mean, I've been reading more organizations doing the same thing. They're equally fond of the Nazis and the Zionists. For them, their vision eventually succeeded. Despite Gandhi and despite some of the other leaders who may have been arguing for a different kind of India, the actual vision, it was the vision of the Hindu nationalists which eventually succeeded. When 1990 rebellion took place in Kashmir, we must not forget that in India at that time, the Hindu right wing was on the rise. That they were also contesting a certain vision of India that was being imposed, where there was no possibility of democratic action or democratically gaining their right to self-determination. And this leads us to the present. In 2014, Narendra Modi becomes the Prime Minister of India. He is not an ordinary man. He's not simply a politician. He's a lifelong member of RSS. He has grown with that ideology. If you go to the online page of RSS, it says that the Kashmir problem is a demographic problem. There are too many Muslims there. For them, the solution is demographic change, genocide, forcible eviction. They're continuously trying to attack, the Kashmiri right to stay in Kashmir. In 2016, when Burhan Wani episode happened, Modi initiated what is called Operation All Out in Kashmir. You can imagine like this language of terrorizing Kashmiris, resonating with things like final solution. And this Operation All Out has been ongoing since 2016, where the military is basically trying to take away both the intellectual, political, cultural leadership of Kashmiris, taking away any vestige of Kashmiri resistance and eroding them and putting them what they call out of circulation. So my last point on this is that really if we have been questioning the Indian left because we also think that they could be potential allies eventually if they get rid of certain inherited notions of nationalism. If they don't see India simply as this map, and they can think about withdrawing and rolling back this imperial understanding. So anti-Modi struggle, anti-fascist struggle in India, which is targeting Indian left as well and targeting Dalits as well, targeting others, smaller communities as well, is intricately tied to anti-occupation struggle in Kashmir. You cannot have Modi uses Kashmir for his own rise. He used this Pulwama incident. He connects all of these dots. The moment the Indian Air Force dropped these bombs, they said that we had used Israeli Spice 2000 bombs. These are like laser-guided bombs that accurately target, drop on the target. In this case, of course, they missed by a huge margin. But his vision is creating this associational chain of Kashmiri Muslim, terrorist, anti-national Muslim in India, Indian left as the fifth column, Israel as an ally, Trump as a possible savior, Modi as the last chance that India has got. So I think, beyond what the international community of activists can do, Indian activists themselves have a role to play here. And that role is to connect the anti-nationalist struggle with the anti-occupation struggle. Questions?
If anyone has a question, we'll pass the mic.
Thank you both for great teaching. Looking at India, Pakistan, and Kashmir as well, we do share a lot in antiquity. And even like as far as the name Srinagar goes, it's a Hindu name. And you pointed out to the map. I think Indians hold this map so dear because it signifies the subcontinent of India and an India undivided by border. Because when we look at India and Pakistan, it is the separation of people based on religion. All right, so my question to you is, given all this information and since everything has occurred since 1947, more or less, do you think this is more or less, or is it safe to call it a civil war between the two? And maybe Kashmir is a struggle for a natural resource, being that the Jhelum River and Indus River, these are all tributaries to each other and they're coming from this region. So I believe maybe it's more or less a civil war. I don't know. What's your take on that?
Don't go with the names. Srinagar is a name that does not have historicity. Kashmiri cities have Kashmiri names. If you go to Srinagar, it's Srinagar. Srinagar became Srinagar in the Dogra, as Hafsa called it. It was a Hindu state which wanted to Sanskritize Kashmiri names. So my hometown was called Anantnag because it had a lot of springs. But the Dogras changed the name into Anantnag, as in like God Ananta lived here, which has no history in common usage. People in that place call Anantnag Islamabad, but not because Islam made that place possible. It was named after an Afghan governor called Islam Khan. So this naming politics works in Bombay, Mumbai, I think, but not in Kashmir. But what you said an interesting thing about there is something shared, right? Yes, there is something shared between India and Iran. There is something shared between India and China too. There's a lot of the Hun Sang coming in and all of that. There is something shared between India and Britain, the hundreds of years of colonial rule. That doesn't mean necessarily that India should be part of Britain still, right? This entire region has been interconnected for millennia. Kashmir has its own history. It has, when I said at the beginning that there is a geographical imagination, if Indians hold the map of India dear, Kashmiris also hold the map of Kashmir dear. Like, how do you place where do you place that in this politics? Like, why should we say that Indian map has much more balance than Kashmir map?
Because I feel like it's the first time if Kashmir were to get its own solidarity, it would be the first time in thousands of years where there's an actual border separating people based on their cultural differences. India is a beautiful place. You see different people of different ethnicities, different languages, different religions. But when you look at the east of Kashmir, we see a region called Tibet, you refer to, as being predominantly Buddhist. When we look at to the west of Kashmir, we see places like Afghanistan. We see the Bamya Buddha statue, and we don't, from a perspective of a Indian person, not forget the religion, as an Indian person, I don't want to see more and more massacres. We're the same people. We share very much in our past, and I would hate to say like a situation now in Afghanistan, Bamya occur where militancy has taken over and the destruction of a UN heritage site. Or even look at, we see the Dalai Lama, we see of China done to Tibet, and we see
We do.
exile of the Dalai Lama in India.
We share cultural connections, but we share a lot of cultural connections with Central Asia. The one thing we don't share, Indians and Kashmiris, is the right to decide our own future. Indians do have that, Kashmiris don't have that.
Maybe we can take 3 questions and then you can answer them.
Okay, my question is, I was particularly troubled by the discourse of the international media on the Palama Incident, because how can you label an attack on a military installation as terrorism? You know, that's not really terrorism. So can you please speak a little bit more on the discourse being used in the media?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important point that you made. Because it was a Kashmiri Muslim who belonged to an Islamist organization, the Jaish-e-Mohammed, evidently, immediately it was the discourse of terrorism. But terrorism is attacks against innocent civilians. And this doesn't, an attack against an army convoy in a context of a war, right? So this is an Indian occupation, 700,000 soldiers. These are, as Junaid mentioned, a new militancy, young people who've been very disillusioned with this violence that they see around them that are taking to arms, but essentially fighting in a state of war against the state. So I definitely don't think the term terrorism really applied here. But again, because Kashmir and everything that happens in Kashmir gets completely subsumed under the war on terror, these words don't even get scrutinized or questioned. It's just immediately dismissed with the use of that terminology.
I was wondering if you could speak to, you said how Kashmir is one of the most militarized places on earth. I don't remember the exact numbers, but something like 1 soldier to every 11 people, something like that. So what sustains the Kashmiri resistance? Like when you think about Ferguson and Palestine, I mean, there's like so much media. It's like, kind of the brand is out there. And in the absence of like widespread international solidarity, what sustains the ability to like keep going on for self-determination, like within the Kashmiri culture?
I think that's a really good question, and one that, when I go there and I see people still struggling is something I ask myself. Like, no one knows mostly what people are going through there and why they're fighting back. But the actual experience of occupation is such that you have no other option, really. The fact that there's so much militarization, the fact that your everyday life is being disrupted to such a level, means that you have no other ways to do anything really but to protest, but to try to take to the streets, write social media posts, knowing that a social media post could get you arrested and in jail under a Public Security Act because you spoke out against the government. But really, it is that life has been made so difficult for people who live there that I don't see what else they can do. It's not within human nature to accept that level of oppression and subjugation.
I thank you for bringing up the liberal culpability in India with what has been going on. Similarly, the Congress Party oversaw the Sikh genocide, a liberal leftist party. But with that being said, similar things, right, have happened in Punjab against Sikhs with the occupation, black cats, things along those lines. But since the 80s, a lot of the popular movement, because of these things, has been crushed in the homeland, in Punjab itself, and is kept alive by the diaspora of Khalistan. What do you think it is, within Kashmir that keeps it alive on the ground, and what kind of support are folks seeing from the Kashmiri diaspora within this struggle?
To add on to what Hafsa has already said, what sustains the struggle, the impossibility of not resisting. Kashmiri resistance is based in deep-rooted sense of history. Kashmiris know their society, they have a hunger for freedom. They lived under Dogra slavery for 100 years and came out stronger. So I think this is the reservoir of strength where the resistance comes from. The second, I think, diaspora, unlike the Punjab diaspora in the West, the Kashmir diaspora hasn't really been that strong. I think, first of all, the Indian government has hundreds of ways to keep a check and tab and surveil and, for instance, denying ability to return to Kashmir, putting people into exile. Yet in UK, for instance, there is a significant Kashmiri diaspora. These are people who were thrown out of Kashmir in 1947, and many of them landed in UK. Many of them were had fought with the British Army against the Nazis in the Second World War. So on the international scene, some of that diaspora, Kashmiri diaspora, has sustained the struggle, but not in the US.
Thank you so much for your talk. I feel completely heartbroken after sitting and hearing you both explain everything about the history of Kashmir. I feel like I thought I knew so much, and then I feel like I have so much more to learn. And with respect to some of the comments before me, I don't know if some of the audience members were listening to the same talk that I was listening to, but I just want to, it's part of my question too, just to challenge us all to not respond with defensive comments about, India or Pakistan being a beautiful place. I'm Pakistani. I have family survived partition and grew up also in Kashmir, and I don't know if everyone was listening to the same talk I was, but I would really challenge us all to be open to listen to what the speakers said, because I feel completely broken just coming away from this. And so I want to ask you all to challenge us doing a lot of the solidarity work in this country, supporting anti-war, anti-colonialism, and indigenous struggles here and around the globe. What challenges can you give us to do better support for Kashmiri struggle for self-determination and independence and for human rights? As you both have said, rightfully so, there has not been enough support and solidarity. And what can we do better to amplify the freedom struggle for Kashmiris?
Thank you. So I don't know how closely you'll be able to see this infographic. I can just read parts of it out loud. But given to Junaid's earlier point about the diaspora, one of the things that happens with the diaspora, Kashmiri diaspora, particularly in the US, is that many of them were, especially those that came in the 70s and the 80s, came for their studies, were part of privileged elite families in Kashmir that benefited in many ways from this colonial relationship with India. So when you think about that kind of a background and a history, then it doesn't necessarily make them the most amenable to really starting a revolution from afar. But I think with the current generation of the Kashmiri diaspora, who've witnessed what's happened since 2008 and 2016 in particular, and are a lot more in touch with social media and things that are happening on the ground, there is really a shift towards understanding the situation and situating it within these global solidarity struggles. So there are groups of people who are working to think of ways to develop solidarity with Kashmir. And for those of you, if you have Facebook or Twitter, follow standwithkashmir.org. It's still a work in progress, but something that came together in the past month with Kashmiri youth-led diaspora in the US. But things that we have been thinking and talking about in ways to show solidarity, one is media outreach. So encouraging your different media that you read, watch, listen to cover Kashmir. This is the biggest sort of struggle, is that these stories, these media narratives don't make it out there. So make sure that they do. When the Palama incident happened, every single outlet that I was reading, there were all these op-eds by people who were not Kashmiri, who were Indian or Pakistani, just framing it again as this territorial dispute and the threat of nuclear war. So writing letters to these papers and to the editors of these papers and making sure that they have the Kashmiri voice. So that's one thing. Other things that people can do is campus and community outreach. So getting people, and we'll try to get a list of speakers and experts on Kashmir together, but hosting teach-ins, similar teach-ins for your campuses, institutions, to really mobilize and raise more awareness. But I definitely think that people need to educate themselves, and that's a way to start, and then see these connections and these links, so that when you have conferences on occupation, for example, conferences on violence, on militarization, incarceration, these are all ways in which you can bring in the Kashmiri perspective as well, and make sure that those voices are represented in those conversations, which they are not, unfortunately, currently.
Hi. I wanted to respond to your call for us in the left from India to come forward and think outside national boundaries. And this is something I wanted to raise, not with any definitive notion of what is right or wrong, but just an idea to think of. Because, everything you said about the Indian state and the military, it's completely believable. Things that you're talking about with violence, I can think of things that are happening in my state of Bengal with, lower caste or Adivasi members or even people in Darjeeling in the last 2 summers who don't want to be a part of Bengal. And the same sort of violence, exclusion, this is sort of working out at different levels in India. I'm not that knowledgeable about what's happening in Bangladesh or Pakistan or Nepal, but from that position of seeing this continuous divisive violence and its and the way it sort of coagulates around the idea of a fixity of a national identity or a regional identity, like a specific local or a regional identity, I'm just wondering, for us to rethink our relationship to space and not be wedded to a specific border or a boundary, can we reimagine regionalism in creative ways beyond Pakistan, beyond India, beyond, say, Nepal, Sikkim, Bhutan, Bangladesh, including Afghanistan, including Tibet, whoever wants to be a part of the region, and rethink ways of relating, sharing resources, living? Because you have to have some kind of a geopolitical imagination within which you must have interactions of solidarity. If you don't have that, you're going to constantly run up against the divisive quality of national boundaries that's going to say, why should, you're showing solidarity to Kashmir, why are you doing that? What about Indians? Or what about Hindu Kashmiris? Those sort of conversations that constantly happen, that erases some of the basic problems that you're trying to raise. It gets erased, I know, in many spaces in India. Maybe it gets erased in the diaspora as well. I don't know if I'm clear about what I'm trying to say, but I'm trying to sort of raise the idea of a creative rethinking of regional identity.
I get you,
Which you
but
can have
this is my
political solidarity.
exactly. I agree with you. I don't mean to interrupt, but do you have more to say?
No, that's it.
Okay.
This is something I think of every time I come to these sort of discussions, but I haven't thought through these things deeply. It's a reaction to things I hear fitfully here and there.
Yep.
Whether it's about Kashmir or whether it's about the Indo-Pak situation or whether it's India's relationship with Bangladesh. From Bangladeshis, I hear it's a very, very oppressive one. So it depends on who you are and where you're standing and what you see.
Yep.
Within India, of course, people may be blissfully unaware of these thoughts coming from their neighbors.
Yes, you're true. You're right, and it's unfortunately true. Let me just say this. I think I agree with you completely. When we say we need to think, I agree that Indians do need to think about this. Indians need to reimagine the state in relationship to what they have done to Dalits, what they have done to Adivasis, what they have done to poor working men and women who live in extreme poverty now and getting impoverished day by day. this vision cannot be outsourced to Kashmiris. You cannot ask Dalits to imagine a better India and locate their struggle by asking, like, we can make India better. They have been doing this forever. They have.
Not India better, a different relationship in this entire subcontinent which is not linked to India. That's what I'm suggesting.
When I said we shouldn't hold on to the map of India so tightly, that's what I mean, that we should not be holding on to this specific vision of India where there is this one state where that has to be centralized, that has to be defended from outside forces. Why can't India live with a free Kashmir? Why is it so hard for Indians to imagine that Kashmiris can be free and have a state of their own? As I said at the beginning, Kashmir itself is a microcosm of multiple imaginings, multiple ethnicities, multiple languages. Just like you have issues of caste in India, we also have issues of caste in Kashmir. We struggle. Unfortunately, we're not able to emphasize those struggles even more because there is this outside force that is over-determining our possibilities. We cannot even imagine solving questions of gender relations, questions of caste justice in Kashmir because Indian army sits on everybody.
I'm asking a slightly different question, though. I don't even think we should be limited to the notion of India when I'm raising this question.
And to maybe say something a bit more, I think resolving Kashmir and really addressing the occupation of Kashmir is critical to any regional reimaginations, creative or otherwise. In one way, this impulse derives from this idea that India is such a strong state, and people almost can't imagine that what we get is, oh, India is never going to let go of Kashmir. So why are you then asking Kashmiris to reimagine how they can live under occupation instead of putting pressure on India to reimagine their occupation?
That's not my question. That's not my question. I think that we should all equally reimagine, not that Kashmiri should reimagine and Indians should.
And I absolutely agree with you. It would be great if we could get to a stage where national boundaries, I mean, the nation state in general is a really fraught and violent concept for sure, because it imagines one homogenous identity within these states, and it has done incredible violence to minorities, it's done incredible violence to religious and different social classes. So this is, of course, a broader South Asia conversation that needs to happen, that needs to address the pain of partition, which still obviously exists. But instrumental to that is resolving Kashmir, because if Kashmir isn't resolved, if the people there don't have their rights to determine their future, how else can you even think about India, Pakistan? This is always going to be the issue.
Okay. Hi, thank you so much for your really wonderful and informative panel. My question is, as a Kashmiri Muslim, a question that I get a lot as kind of like a, oh, gotcha, is what about Kashmiri Pandits? And I don't actually know a lot about Kashmiri Pandits because I feel that I can't find really unbiased sources. So since you guys are here, I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about the plight of Pandits and what that history has looked like in Kashmir.
Kashmiri Pandit population before 1990 in Kashmir was 5% of the population. From 1990 to 1999, when Kashmiri Pandits, they moved out of Kashmir because of a variety of factors, and the most important being fear. They were afraid of their own place in the society. Close to 219 Kashmiri Pandits were killed. Some of them were targeted killings by militants. These were of those Kashmiri Pandits who were higher up in the government, including judges. One of the judge who had sentenced Maqbul Bhatt, a prominent independence leader, to death. There were some others who were part of the Jan Sangh, which was like one of the parent parties of the BJP, or earlier manifestations of the BJP. But there were also ordinary Kashmiri Pandits in several cases who died during this time. Many of there was one massacre in which I think around 40 Kashmiri Pandits were shot to death. Nobody claimed responsibility for those deaths, and this is a painful part of Kashmir's independence struggle. The migration of Kashmiri Pandits out of Kashmir is part of a larger involuntary migration out of Kashmir since 1947. As Hafsa mentioned, the genocide in Jammu in 1947 led to the forced exodus of 250,000 Muslims from that region. Close to 200,000 Muslims in that region were massacred. Since 1990 also, close to 70,000 other Kashmiris, primarily Muslim, have been killed. So this is, when we think about the plight of Kashmiri Pandits, we don't think it as separate from the plight of Kashmiri Muslims. They have historically been part and parcel of Kashmiri society. Their pain is one of the chapters in the larger story of pain in the region. Unfortunately, much of the discourse about Kashmiri Pandits has been taken over by the Hindu right wing in India, who try to posit the Kashmiri Pandit pain as to negate the other Kashmiri pain. That's not the Kashmiris don't see it that way. I mean, I not only grew up in Kashmir, I grew up actually in a neighborhood. We had several Kashmiri Pandit homes nearby. I grew up when my parents were, young and struggling. I was the firstborn. They still didn't have jobs. They were renting a house which belonged to Kashmiri Pandits. I was actually born in that house. So I have very fond memory. And when our neighbor was building, who was a Kashmiri Pandit, was building a house, they rented part of the house that we had built. So these were quite close connections. It wouldn't have been possible in 1990 for suddenly everything to shatter. In 1947, when India was burning, the British India, when Hindus were killing Muslims, Muslims were killing Hindus along the border in Bengal and Punjab, Gandhi said the only ray of light was Kashmir, where the Kashmiri Muslims were not harming Kashmiri Pandits, even though Kashmiri Pandits were a small, minute percentage of the population. So you have to look at this longer history instead of the question that is, of course, you get asked often is to cherry pick one pain and privilege it over other pains. That's not the resolution of this. Even now, if you go, all the people who are in the Kashmiri freedom struggle, including Hurriyats and JKLFs and other parties, pro-independence parties, they have all asked Kashmiri Pandits to return, and I can't vouch for the credibility of their promises, but the Kashmiri Pandits themselves are now dispersed around the world, just like Kashmiri Muslims. Many of them perhaps would want to go back, especially those who ended up in miserable conditions in India. But those who didn't may not want to go back. So this is a very complicated question. I think it both has to be looked ethically. These conversations, I can tell you, have been ongoing within the Kashmiri movement itself. That's where most of the critical conversations, ethical conversations have been happening.
Hi, thank you for being here and thank you for all the information. I have a question. So my question is, let's assume that in some world, India is going to back down from Kashmir. What do you think is so one of the strongest rhetorics from my perspective, and I could be wrong, please correct me if I am, is the fact that India should not back down from or come out of Kashmir because Pakistan is going to come and invade India from, let's say, Himachal Pradesh or Punjab. That's what people talk about. So obviously, if you want India to come out of Kashmir, do you see, as an immediate solution, do you see UN peacekeepers? How do you see Kashmir? Obviously, Kashmir has been oppressed. Kashmiris have been oppressed for so long. How do you think you're going to pick up the pieces? I'm just curious, because that's one of the things that most people say, so what do you think is going to happen? So from your perspective, what do you think should happen, or what do you think is going to is?
Yeah, I think both of us can speak to this, but from my perspective, I think the most important thing is that conditions need to be created for Kashmiris to be able to live a life without fear and suppression, so that they can then take the steps, whatever they decide is their roadmap, to finally determine their future. So immediate to that is demilitarization. You can't have 700,000 Indian troops in Kashmir overlooking this population and committing all these human rights violations. So I think that's the first step. The second step, well, actually before that step, is for India and to a certain extent Pakistan to acknowledge that this is an international dispute. So from 47, when this was an issue in the United Nations, it was an international dispute. Then it became just between India and Pakistan, right? Other countries weren't technically allowed to get involved. Now it's just India's internal matter that even Pakistan has no say in, evidently. So to reframe that and to really foreground Kashmiris as this is an international dispute that the international community has a right to get involved and have a say in. Demilitarization, addressing the vast number of human rights violations that have occurred and bringing the perpetrators of those human rights violations to justice, and then creating a political space for Kashmiris. I'm not a huge fan of UN peacekeeping forces because sometimes they create more trouble than not, but some kind of space where people can express themselves, express political views, away from the threat, not just of India, but also Pakistani interests as well in the region. And then some more tangible steps towards holding some kind of a referendum or mechanism for self-determination. And for us, this seems so far-fetched, but it's actually not far-fetched. It's happened in the past. It's the only logical and rational way of addressing this issue. And that is a point that I think really needs to be made clear, that India can't be the only one calling the shots on this issue. And determining things as they want to.
I just wanted to say something to that. When I was doing research 3 years ago, and I was talking to these young people in Kashmir, and I would often ask them, what kind of Kashmir do you want? What would a free Kashmir look like? The typical answer they would give me was everything but not India and Pakistan. We don't want to look like them. It is not in the interest of Kashmir to have military, to have the same apparatus that has been oppressing them. There are multiple ways to imagine what that future Kashmir could look like, and it is the responsibility of India and Pakistan. It's not a territorial dispute between them, but because they have to repair what they have damaged over the last 70 years. They have to make efforts to create the conditions that Hafsa is talking about by withdrawing, by creating a positive space in which Kashmiris can express themselves and create a society that is safe, that is free, and that's not hyper-nationalistic and militaristic, the one they are currently living under.
I have a question that is similar to the one about geopolitical imaginaries, but it pertains more to international solidarity. So as subjects either in neocolonial superpowers, post-colonies, or occupied spaces, we are all consumers of cartography in one way or another. And political cartography as it exists now is not only a product of colonial technologies such as war-making, statecraft, and treaties, but is also itself a juridical and social technology that continues to perpetuate itself. And so my question is, when you look at issues such as the Moroccan occupation of the Sahrawi Arab Republic, when you look at West Papua, when you look at Kurdistan, when you look at Kashmir, you see the margins of this cartography, and you see the fringes of those margins. And you see the manner in which colonial cartography continues to expose itself through its violence, through its genocide, through its depredations. So in terms of international solidarity, how can we elevate these seemingly disparate conflicts in a manner that can help to popularize and decolonize cartography as we understand it today? Thank you.
A few years ago, we participated in a workshop called Everyday Occupations, where activist scholars from Chittagong Hill Tracts, from Kurdistan, from Kashmir, I was talking about that, and many other occupied spaces around the world came together to think about this precise question: what is it? Is occupation a symptom of something larger? And as you correctly diagnose, it is. It's this colonial cartography that has created, these conflicts around the world, which seem irresolvable right now. Like, as our previous speaker said, let's imagine in some world, the question then is, like, what do we do? What do we do about them? How do we connect? Over the years, in my graduate studies, I came across people precisely talking about Western Sahara. When I would talk about Kashmir, they would be like, oh, our experiences are the same. When you talk about Kurdistan, Kashmir, Kurds say, oh, this is what we have gone through. Similar technologies of control, similar mechanisms of occupation, similar forms of violence imposed on all of these people. These are not simply restless places that need to be suppressed. This is a symptom of a wider global phenomena. The solidarity that you're asking for is precisely to be built by interconnecting these struggles. When Hafsa was talking about earlier, imagining all of these places together, why is Kashmir not being raised? Kashmir becomes a lens to understand Western Papua. Kashmir becomes a lens to talk about Kurdistan. Kurdistan becomes a lens to talk about Western Sahara. So solidarity can begin if we begin to ask questions, if we link these questions together. These are not isolated examples. These are not specific cases. These, I use the term resonance. They resonate across different places. Over the years that I have spoken about Kashmir, I typically have a Palestinian, a Kurd, or all of these nationalities, nations that are stifled under occupations, show up and say, same thing happened to us. I don't know if that solves anything, but.
Hi, thank you very much. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more, especially in light of the prevalence of rape under military occupation, about kind of the positioning of gender, or specifically resistance movements that are being led by women in Kashmir, and whether or not there is maybe a possibility around transnational feminist movements, or there's lots of examples of women leading peace building and demilitarization in other parts of the world. So are there possibilities there? What exactly is happening on the ground right now? Things like that.
Yeah, thank you for that question. There's of course possibilities for that, given that occupation itself is constructed in such gendered terms. Just to give you one example, Parvina Hunger, who she's a founder of an organization called Association for the Parties of Disappeared Peoples, Parents of Disappeared People, APDP, as they're known locally. And she's the only Kashmiri woman who's been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. And her son was actually picked up during the time of the militancy by the Indian Army, and he was enforced disappeared, and she has been, since that time, been looking for him and going to different courts and going to different jails and asking about his whereabouts. And with her doing that, she also connected with other families and other women who were doing the same for their spouses or their sons. So they created this organization. So women have been very integral from 1931 itself to the struggle for self-determination. Women have been killed in the struggle, obviously, but also killed in participating in protests and other features of the resistance. So they haven't necessarily played an integral role within the different pro-freedom movements. There are women-led parties, but of course, as what happens in other cases of occupation, there's a patriarchy that exists on that level as well, that I think this younger generation is really contesting and pushing against. So the image that you saw, the first image on our slide and the image for this event is, and we decided to choose it, I mean, that was a very deliberate decision, is young Kashmiri schoolgirls from actually a very upper middle class college, a college that families who might not send their kids outside of Kashmir, but would send them to the best schools in Kashmir. They send them there, and you see them throwing stones or protesting against the army and against the army presence. And there's numerous instances of protests of young female students throughout the 70-year history. But of course, nobody wants to pay attention to it. What you instead get is, and there is, of course, a victimization that happens as well. There's the cases of rape. There's the images that you see is usually a woman crying and being victimized and having something done to them. You don't necessarily see these empowering images of women. And there's, of course, an entire context of Islamophobia that also plays into this victimization narrative. That for the longest time, the narrative was that Kashmiri women are sort of oppressed on one side by the state, but also oppressed on the other side by the militants or the rebels, when that equation doesn't really factor in when you actually go on the ground and talk to people. Throughout the past 3 years, women have helped the rebels. They've housed them, they've given them food to make sure that they've escaped safely, and those are the narratives that you don't often hear about.
Thank you for absolutely timely presentation, both of you. Of course, occupation has to end. I mean, I don't think there's any two-way about that. And any kind of a progressive left understanding has to start with the right for self-determination. I want you to talk about something else. And I've heard Junaid for a very long time, and I've always been impressed by the way in which you present a sense of Kashmiriyat as having a pluralistic vision, right? I think this distinguishes the Kashmiri struggle against occupation from very many other struggles that are very quickly reduced to a sectarian or an ethnic state, right? So tell us a little bit about how and to what extent this kind of a pluralistic Kashmiriyat has sustained through ups and downs and some very, very dark periods right now going through, and what is the role of the left inside Kashmir, and if you can, what then? I mean, I cannot imagine that there is no role for a Pakistani left and an Indian left to talk about these things, if at all that happens, right? And even in the diaspora, sometimes that becomes very difficult. So these things go very deep, but I don't want to go too far out. I just want to say something about, hear from both of you, about the ethnic pluralistic vision of a free Kashmir. And there has to be that. Else it's, in the end, of course, occupation, I mean, it has to be an anti-occupation struggle. I think that's where we have to begin with. I'm fully on board on that, for whatever that's worth, right? But I hope it's worth something, right? That, even if it's a Herculean task and you have named it, that it has to start with an end of militarization and then some kind of a plebiscite or whatever, right? But tell us about the ethnic pluralistic vision.
I can maybe say one thing.
You want to say? Yeah, go ahead.
So to maybe answer that question, I wanted to give one example of something that happened recently after the Pulwama attacks. As Junaid mentioned, the Kashmiri students that were in India were being beaten up. Many of them had to, because they were scared, they had to fly back to Kashmir, right? So they're leaving India in peace, but going to an occupied zone because they won't feel that threat there anymore that they did from these mobs in India. Within Kashmir, there were a number of Indian tourists that were there, mostly Hindu, and even as as the conditions on the ground change, sometimes there's moments of peace, sometimes there's a lot of tension, but tourists come and go to Kashmir, mostly Indian tourists. And the airport was closed locally, so the tourists were essentially stranded. And the Kashmiris that are there locally opened up the hotels and made accommodations free for Indian tourists who most likely don't exactly have a very pro-Kashmir sentiment or a pro, understanding of what their role in their government's role in India is as an occupation. And there were images on social media of them being welcomed into homes of people so that they could get free food and all of that. And this has really, the fact that this is such a population that has been completely dehumanized in the Indian public and elsewhere, and that kind of response, I have absolutely no doubt that any future vision of Kashmir, if given to people without the threat of, even under the threat of the gun and an occupation, their vision is still, beyond caste or beyond nationalistic or ethnic boundaries. So imagine if that threat wasn't there, how much more it would be really trying to hold on to that idea of Kashmiriyat. So that's just more of an anecdotal case, but I think that's, it's imperative that that is the vision for Kashmiri society.
I just have two things to say. I will not elaborate upon that vision, but I think what makes that vision possible is my question. First of all, I think despite the occupation, and Médecins Sans Frontières, the Doctors Without Borders, recently came out with a report saying that 70% of Kashmiris suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, that an ordinary Kashmiri in their lifetime has seen 7 incidents of extreme violence, which would really throw anyone off the cliff. But despite this kind of mental torture, psychological torture that Kashmiris have gone through, the basic humanity of people, like that Hafsa has mentioned, sustains on an everyday basis. The Kashmiri society remains hospitable despite the Indian soldiers. I can give you an example from my neighborhood itself, where people, during these crackdowns, when the soldiers would come, people would offer them water. Do you want some water? Even though we were being, oppressed. This was very unique to me. And I'm not saying giving some special privilege to Kashmiri character as such, but it makes me wonder, what is it that makes it possible? As I said earlier, the sources of this hospitality, of this humanity, of this ability to think beyond your own narrowness, parochial identity, lies in our historic understanding of the self, of the pluralistic history of Kashmir. Second, the political conditions. Kashmir, you mentioned the role of the left. Before 1947, during the struggle against the Dogra state, there was a very popular document called Naya Kashmir, which was adopted by, at that time, National Conference, which was seeking, a democratic government, self-government in Kashmir. They didn't have an idea of India at that time. They were going to be forced to join India or Pakistan. This Naya Kashmir or New Kashmir document was perhaps one of the most socialist documents adopted in South Asia. During that time, they were saying that there should be a right to work. Women should get maternity leave and all of those things. It's fascinating. I invite you to all read that document and see how is it that a population that had been suppressed for 100 years under the Dogras adopted and envisioned a society like that. Kashmir was also the first place, despite the trauma of imperial wars over Kashmir in 1947, the first place where the land reforms took place. The land was redistributed not because India wanted, despite Indian pressure. It was the force of the people from the ground that forced the leaders at that time to distribute the land and talk about questions of social justice and equality. So all of that gives me a hope that Kashmir is very fertile for freedom and imagining a possible state that does not look like militarized states, other militarized so-called post-colonies, which I think are post-colonial empires, really.
So this has come up a couple of times. you mentioned the sort of inability to center Kashmir in the fallout from Pulwama, and it's sort of getting sucked into a back and forth between India and Pakistan. And I was wondering, I believe there was a comment on how the Indian diaspora has also sort of like massively contributed to that. And I was wondering what strategies work in terms of getting around that sort of like gravitational pull, like talking about the two big superpowers in the region, like what works and what can sort of be like implemented to like bring this to like a broader medium.
I think one thing that works is to share the human stories of what's been going on the ground. So I have a very hard time with Indian friends of mine who still kind of hold on to this idea of India as being completely indivisible without Kashmir. But once you actually speak to them about what militarization looks like, what occupation looks like, what it means for a 4-year-old girl to be pelleted in her eyes, and these sort of more human stories, I think that raising those stories to different forums is really important. So that's maybe one way to at least make an entry point. But again, what happens with that is that there's a tension between seeing Kashmir as just a human rights issue, and most Kashmiris don't see it as just a human rights issue. It's not that if the Indian military stops doing what it does in Kashmir that everything is going to be fine. There's still a political resolution that needs to take place and solving the actual dispute. So those kinds of stories and those kinds of narratives need to be brought to the fore, but they also have to be talked about in conjunction with an actual political solution.
And also, I think that the diasporic vision of the home country is always filled with nostalgic nationalism. I mean, we know from like the money that is sent from Indian diaspora to fund the right-wing BJP. It's like enormous. Like, but what can the left in the diaspora do? I mean, that's the question you have to ask to break apart this. I mean, as I said before, that the Indian diaspora is not a homogeneous group too. There are pockets which have possibilities. Some of them are embedded within academia. Others, like Murali here, have been struggling for years for a better India, for a better conversation about Kashmir. So you have to, crack open those spaces too, and not let the nationalistic diaspora take over the entire, space.
I think we have time for one more. Thank you. Hi, I wondered if you talk about the forms of resistance taken up by the aesthetics, in terms of there's a lot of rap music. I mean, you're talking about since 2010, and even Mir Sohail is doing this kind of cartoon, kind of poetry. And also, the communication of that, it often happens through social media channels, but at the same time, you find a clamp down on communication and WhatsApp propaganda happening in the heartland. So maybe something about, and also it's in the language of English. So what do these forms of resistance in terms of aesthetics do?
Yeah, so after 2010, and with the rise of social media, I think Kashmiris really realized the importance of making sure that their narratives got out there. And what you really have is a group, after a long time, of people who are both in Kashmir but also in the diaspora, who are in the humanities and in the social sciences. So for the longest time, the only people actually studying Kashmir, getting their PhDs on Kashmir, were Indians, mostly, and that history was being told from that perspective. And now you have Kashmiris who are doing their PhDs on Kashmir and uncovering some of these stories. So in terms of scholarship, a lot has changed. In terms of the humanities, everyone might know of memoirs. The first memoir that really broke out of Kashmir was Basharat Pir's Curfew Nights. But since then, there's been other novels. Mirza Wahid, who's based in the UK, Munnu, by a graphic novel by a Kashmiri cartoonist, Malik Sajjad. and a whole host of different musicians, artists, people really trying to find creative ways to tell the story and using social media to do that. And of course, their efforts then, get completely shut down many times with the Indian state, with the different social media bans. But there is a lot of space for that, and I think those artists need support. They need help. They need places where their work can be exhibited. They need some kind of interconnections with places and institutions outside of Kashmir as well to really be able to train them and elevate their work in many ways. So all of that is definitely happening, but should of course be happening a lot more.
Thanks so much, everybody, for an engaging discussion. There were a lot of questions, and I really like that. Also, I want to let everyone know on Friday, March 29, we are going to be screening Khundi Bara, or Blood Leaves Its Trail. So we'll have a continuation of the discussion, and Hafsa will be joining us again. So I hope to see you all there. Thank you, and have a good evening.
Khundi Bara is one of these artistic productions that is just coming out, and it's about enforced disappearances in Kashmir, and about gendered violence as well. So.